In the first 4 programs of this series, Lynn Stodola and I have tried to bring alive for you the musical models of the Age of Enlightenment. The models of musical classicism, sonata form, minuet and trio, and their simpler components. The models of the Baroque era, the fugue and the invention. We started with the simplest of all these forms, the form which we could say, with its A-B characteristic, was simple binary form. We were then able to take a form which was also bipartite, consisting of 2 equal divisions of musical time. But because this division consisted of 2 equal portions of musical material, a portion that digressed before returning to the initial material. This bipartite division we could call modified ternary form. We then moved on to show you how a 3-fold multiplication of modified ternary form could create that very important structure, the corollary of the classic arch in music, the minuet and trio form. Minuet, trio, minuet. A, B, A. We then proceeded to show you how this same 3-fold inner division could be rearticulated, expanded, made more sophisticated in sonata form with its exposition, first subject group, second subject group, codetta, its balancing, recapitulation, its inner excursion, the development section. In today's program, in the latter half of it, we will be hearing 19th century compositions which go to work on some of these forms, indeed the simpler ones of them, and infuse them with the spirit of romantic poetry. But before we do that, I would like to extend another kind of experience that we have shared together over these programs. We have been able to involve ourselves with some illustrations from the Commonwealth of the Arts. We have shown you a picture of an organ case of the Baroque and drawn a parallel to this with the fugue form. We have shown you, in addition to the classical architecture, the ability to go inside the sonata movements of Mozart and Haydn, showing you the mosaic patterns of Roman Britain and other tapestries, stained glass windows. We've shown you the interior of a Norfolk music room dating 1756, in which we were able there to show how, in terms of interior decorating, the movements of Haydn's sonatas, his style, could be visually appreciated in a room dating from his own era. Well, what we'd like to do now is to go through a series of illustrations showing you how closely the simple forms that we have heard and seen in model form also appear in architecture and in interior decorating, and how these find their fruition, really, in the neoclassic movement in France, particularly in the 18th century, the chronological correlation to Viennese classicism. What we're looking at now, we've already seen in the first program on minuet, trio minuet form, the so-called classic arch. In this Ionic temple from the Acropolis, you see, as we said before, time passing. The passing of that time, as you look across the facade of that structure, that time articulated into equal subsections by the columns, the dynamism of this static facade given by the surge to the peak at the midpoint, even as the music was articulated at the midpoint as a cue for us to gather up what we had experienced and prepare ourselves for the denouement in the second half to come. The inner divisions, expanding in length or given different subsections, can be seen in the next illustration. Here, also at the Acropolis, in this case a Doric temple of the Parthenon, you see the model is expanded. Even as in Beethoven's middle period, the larger sonatas, the great symphonies, the Eroica, the Third Symphony, and later on to come the Ninth Symphony and the larger, more complex piano sonatas, the model remains constant but can be extended to become more dramatic. The inner subsections increase, but at the same time, peculiarly enough, we become less aware of them as we are caught up in the overall sweep and drama of the architectural event. Even as listeners, we are caught up in the sweep and drama of Beethoven's content. And we are already on the road to what we will hear a little later on in this program, how our attention ultimately will be captured by the content and we begin to accept the form. This is quite apparent then as we move to our third example. Here, a drawing of the plan for the facade of the Temple of Apollo at Syracuse. You see now the weights and the masses of our columns, even as in Beethoven's middle period and in early Romanticism, weights and masses come more and more into play. There is more division, subsections, there is more to look at, even as in the music there is more to hear. But the overall shape has remained the same. We see this pushed to an even further point in our fourth example, the Temple of Artemis at Corfu. Here, perhaps more grace and with more decoration, more detail as we rise to the peak of the arch form. That detail will find its corollary in early Romanticism with echoes of the grace and ornamentation of Mozart. Like our musical model of sonata form, the model of classical equilibrium can have its content extended, its details elaborated, but the model is faithfully adhered to. As we pass on to the architecture of the Renaissance, we have Brunelleschi's Cappella Pazzi, Florence, dating 1430. Look at that facade. There is more details, there is much more excitement and interest as we have additions in the upper level of our visual experience. And we begin to have something that very much reminds us of sonata form, where we have a subdivided outer equilibrium and an inner section which is fresh, which is different. It forms a point of departure. The classical equilibrium still present as in sonata form, but now there is more attention to the central section, and as the eye lifts, the rhythm of the curved arch in the center is caught up by the curves of the upper levels of the architectural structure. So too, in the second of this pair of examples, from the work of Alberti, 30 years later, 1460, Sant'Andrea, Mantua. Here, more and more attention being paid to the central section, the development. The eye is thrust to the center, not only by the peak of the arch, but also by the aperture underneath, and we begin to accept the outer portions. And as you listen to later Beethoven symphonies and to the early Romantic composers and their symphonies and sonatas, you will hear the same thing, that more and more the development section receives the creativity, the attention, the excitement, and serves as truly the central point of our interest, the outer sections being simply counterfoils and suppliers of the information which will be worked upon. But the fact that the center of attraction here is an open space is also suggestive of the openness to development and experiment of that excursion area we talked about, open to be filled with the spirit of Romantic poetry in the years to come. The next pair of illustrations, beginning with a Regency house in Cheltenham, showing us the return to the classical principles as a corollary to musical classicism of the 18th century. At first, a conscious attempt to be as strictly ordered in our symmetries as possible, even as in the early sonata. But in the next example, the Monticello of Thomas Jefferson, slightly earlier actually in chronology, we find, as in the Renaissance building, the facade is present, but already our attention is being paid to the development of the central areas, the possibilities that lie in invention, developing, taking away, taking off from the initial material. One of the most fascinating visual corollaries, however, correlative also in terms of chronology, can be found in perhaps a less well-known area of the arts, 18th century French decorative arts. And I'd like you to see 4 examples of this. What we're looking at now is a console table, and here, in essence, is a BA classical form. The outer part, the legs, if you will, are identical. There is inner action derived from the shape of the decoration. The totality of ABA is very clear. The grace is present too, as we mentioned, such an important feature of the music of, let us say, Mozart. In the next example, we are looking at a granite chimney piece. And here again, accepting the outer equilibrium as giving us certain amount of relatively expected information, notice how our attention is thrust to the center, the area of development, as you were, that open-endedness in the ABA possibility that soon will become such a feature of the sonata form. That combination of shape, grace, and fluidity can be seen in the next example, which is a wrought iron handrail, which once was in the home of Madame de Pompadour. The ornamentation, the curves are there, as you heard it in the music of Mozart and Haydn, but there is a rhythmic progression reminding us of the inner content of Haydn sonatas, combined with that overall curve and grace, which reminds us of a Mozart. Finally, in our last example, an armoire of brass with tortoiseshell marquetry. And in this example, we find the same threefold division we have been talking about. But now, once again, it is the intersection which picks up the shapes of the ornamentation of the information-giving exposition, and our eyes directed immediately to the thrust, the dynamism, and the strength of that inner development section. And so, both from the realms of architecture and from interior decoration, we can perhaps begin to grasp that what happens in one art form, such as the musical models of classicism we have been hearing, can also find its correlation in the other artistic gestures of mankind within the commonwealth of arts. Now what we would like you to hear is a sequence of 3 compositions which pick up these basic models and play with them, showing you how the 19th and 20th century has accepted some of these, and by extending or telescoping, fills them with musical poetry and makes them serve their own, sometimes extra musical, sometimes even psychological meanings and values. The first of these, a Brahms intermezzo, is in a overall A-B-A form. But the lyric inner material, the so-called B section, really takes over. It's an example then of an initial statement in somber harmonic clusters and quiet timbre, which will come back again at the end. But our main attention is in that intersection as the lyricism, the pathos of the 19th century spirit takes over. Let us listen while Lynn Studola plays for us the intermezzo in A minor by Johannes Brahms. The second example from the 19th century use of ABA form is by Schumann, a scherzo from one of his piano sonatas. You will hear here the ABA again, but this time the difference between the sections is very difficult to grasp. It is there in the quality of the music, but the overall rhythmic gestures and patterns are quite similar. In other words, we accept the model and let the musical poetry take over. Our last musical example is a delightful little piece by the contemporary Soviet composer Dmitri Kabalevsky. It is the first movement of his Sonatina for piano and is very clear-cut first movement sonata form with a very easily distinguishable difference between the crisp chords of the first subject and the little lyric of the second subject. Lynn Stodola is going to play this for us now, and I know that you will enjoy it as a wrap-up of the musical experiences we've had together. Brahms, Schumann, Kabalevsky. Three very personal ways of realizing, in the terms of their own aesthetic, in their own society, received models. We as listeners can use these models as tools for learning, tools for appreciating the music of our heritage, and also perhaps by realizing that in the music of our own day, these models are completely insufficient because composers of our century have departed from them, with rare instances in the so-called neoclassic period where it is a stated thing that they are following these. In the mainstream of the evolution of today's music, the departure from these models has left us in an ambiguous situation. I feel lost in the form, some people say. It has no form, say others. I can't hear the melody. There is no melody, say others. Perhaps as we learn to appreciate the models of our inheritance, we can seek to develop new strategies, perhaps even new models, for an appreciation of the music composed since 1900. As it is, however, I hope that these models will serve you as they served their masters.